Recording and streaming has been started.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to yet another session of Roundtable discussion from Council for Strategic Affairs. We are going to have a very interesting roundtable discussion today. Those of you who registered using our Eventbrite announcement probably saw this flyer, which details the topic as well as our distinguished panelists. So today is Saturday, November 9, 2024, 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime. It is 8:30 p.m. in India, and it is 11 p.m. in China and Beijing, because we have participants, distinguished panelists from all over the world. Before we start, a little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. CSA imparts education in the field of international relations. The Council fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. We encourage strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. We condemn terrorism in all its forms worldwide. The Council aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. The Council promotes people-to-people contacts and track-to diplomacy. Just for sake of your information, we are registered as a 501c3 organization with the Internal Revenue Service in the United States. We are a non-profit organization, and we hope that our audience joining from United States will support us and donate to CSA. The link is there on the website as well as on this PowerPoint. We have a monthly roundtable discussion, just like we are having today. It is held on second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime. Generally, we have a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert on fourth Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. We have a new feature called Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee. It's a one-on-one interview. We organize symposia, meetings, and conferences. We promote publication of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. We have a summer internship program for college students and a fellowship training program in strategic studies. So, topic of today's roundtable discussion is Brettonwoods versus BRICS, a clash of titans. And as I said, we have distinguished panelists that include Professor Seshadri Chari, who's joining us from India, Professor David Soong, who's joining us from China, Mr. Vijay Nilekeni, who's joining from Mexico, and Ambassador Kamal Sibal, who's joining from India. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists. This is Professor Seshadri Chari. Professor Chari is a journalist, author, and an acclaimed commentator on strategic and security issues with vast experience in formulation of policies of national security and actionable strategic plans. He was the editor of English weekly called Organizer for 12 years from 1992 to 2004. He is Professor Emeritus at Savitribai Phule Pune University in Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. He has been engaged as a consultant in various international organizations. He is fluent in multiple languages, including Sanskrit, English, Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, Tamil, Malayalam, Kannada, Punjabi, and Nepali. He has been member of various institutions that are listed here. He has numerous publications. He has edited a volume called India's Nuclear Doctrine, Economic Federalism, India's Look East, Phase 2, Democracy at Work, etc., etc. So very well-rounded intellectual, professor, strategic thinker, and we are very glad to have him. Our second panelist is Professor David Soong. Professor David Soong is currently an associate professor in linguistics, and if I'm pronouncing correctly, Zunye Medical University. He teaches a general introduction to China to international students, mainly from Asian countries, and does translation-related courses to Chinese foreign language learners. His academic focus is on the contrastive study of Chinese and English aiming to reveal the similarities and dissimilarities between both languages. He is an expert member of Translators Association of China. He also serves on the local committee of China Democratic Construction Association. He's a member of local branch of China's People's Political Consultative Conference. He has tabled more than 10 proposals to local governments. And I am very happy to say that Professor David Soong has appeared on our platform before and has graciously consented to participate in the discussion today. Our third panelist is going to be Mr. Vijay Nilekeni. Mr. Nilekeni is an engineer with a master's from A&M University in Texas. He has served in various corporations, some in India, some in US. He was working with Nuclear Energy Institute in Washington, DC from 2005 to 2014. His business careers have spent more than 45 years in energy industry, 8 years in oil and gas, 37 years in nuclear industry. He is a widely traveled thinker and intellectual who has personally visited more than 110 countries. Currently, he's writing a book. He has a lot of activities, hobbies, etc. He has been living at this point in time in Mexico as a retired professional. And our last panelist is Ambassador Dr. Kamal Sibal. And I'm not going to introduce Ambassador Kamal Sibal. The reason is that he's so prominent that he does not require any introduction from me. Whatever I say would be too little and too, small thing to say. I'll just say two things. He's the former Foreign Secretary to Government of India, and he's currently working as a Chancellor in Jawaharlal Nehru University. So those is introductions of our distinguished panelists. Our topic is Brettonwoods versus BRICS. So this map gives you the 5 BRICS countries. It started as 4 countries. South Africa was added later on. In 2003, there was talk about BRIC expansion. That is what was talked about in 2023. So combined GDP of around 30% of the world, combined population, world population of 46%, total oil production of 43% of the world, and exports of goods around 25%. And that tells you as of 4th January 2023, what were the countries that were proposed to be members. So you have here comparison of G7 country, which is the dominant economic bloc from the West, versus expanded G7 as conceptualized in 2023. And here you have map of the BRICS countries or the BRICS plus countries in the recent BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia. Almost 40%, 40 countries participated in this particular Kazan meeting. Besides the 5 original members, 4 new members joined. Participation from Saudi Arabia was at foreign minister level. So we will have this discussion. The format is that after my introduction, each panelist will be given 8 minutes for an opening statement. And I will request my distinguished panelists to not exceed the 8 minutes limit. If some previous panelist has gone into the history of BRICS or something like that, please don't repeat that so you can focus on your particular presentation. We'll have a moderated discussion lasting for 20 minutes and then question and answer from the audience for 25 minutes. Just for sake of information, I have opening statements in writing from most of the panelists, and we will upload on our website after this event is over. So there are some housekeeping rules. I would expect everyone to, keep themselves on mute to avoid the noise interference. Please change your cell phone setting to vibration mode. Please do not try to interrupt our esteemed panelists Only those members of audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to ask questions. So no anonymous questioners, please. Please be precise in asking your questions. All the questions have to be sent through the chat room. The program is being recorded as well as being live streamed on our YouTube channel. So there are some people who are watching it from our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I am going to give the floor to Professor Seshadri Chari, who is going to be our first speaker. So Professor Chari, the platform is yours. Welcome to CSA platform.
Thank you.
My hope is that you will give us somewhat elaboration of Indian point of view on this topic.
Thank you, Adityanjee, for those very kind words. Um, um, when you contacted me, in fact, I was actually planning to write something on the same subject because I write for some of the magazines in India and abroad also. So I found a very interesting parallel. The 16th.
Sir, you are muted. Kindly unmute yourself. You are muted, sir.
Now is it okay? I think, huh?
Yeah, it's okay now.
Yeah. It went into unmute mode. I don't know how it went in. So, I mean, being not from the artificial intelligence generation, a little bit of problems comes. The 16th summit of BRICS, which was held in Kazan, is actually a very significant meeting. And your subject, which you have chosen, is absolutely correct. From Brettonwoods to BRICS, the parallels. If I tell you the parallels, it is very amazing. In the sense, as you very rightly said, the Brettonwoods was held in 1944. BRICS Kazan held in 2024. That is exactly 80 years apart. In this 80 years, if you see, 80 years back, when the Bretton Woods was held in 1944, nearly 44 countries attended. In Kazan, again, 40 countries attended. But more than 40 countries, there were other countries which were invited also, but more importantly, 40, to be exact, almost 40 countries. And in Bretton Woods, there were 44 countries. Now, Bretton Woods was actually held in the background of the Second World War. Second World War is still raging. There were a lot of problems. So it was in the background of Second World War. And you remember you can go back to Second World War and see the status of economies of these countries. The British economy, the economy of European Union. There was no European Union, but the Europe as such, the countries in the Europe were all in a very horrible status. The same kind of situation existed when the BRICS meeting was held at Kazan. Most of the European economies are in very bad shape, and some of the South Asian countries' economies are also in a bad shape because of basically two wars that are taking place: the war in the Middle East and also the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So it is in this background, in the background of a war, a meeting takes place in Bretton Woods. In the background of a war, a meeting takes place in Kazan, 80 years apart. Okay, now what happened? The Bretton Woods, basically the agreement in Bretton Woods was to fix the currency rates of all these countries to that exchange of the US dollar, and which it in return could be redeemed in gold. But this system changed a little later, and unlike many of the allies of the US at that time, the US economy by itself was in a slightly better shape in comparison to other economies. And soon after this Bretton Woods, the economic system, a new economic system followed. A new world order was also put in place, and this world order was supported by the US dollar And that sowed the seeds of International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, that is IBRD, and International Monetary Fund. Now come to BRICS Summit in Kazan, attended by 40 countries, taking place at the time of a war and also at a time when we all are trying to recover from a worst kind of pandemic in the century. The pandemic affected all the countries of the world. Like World War I and World War II, which affected all the countries of the world, the pandemic also affected all the countries of the world. And the post Second World War recovery was as painful as the post pandemic economic recovery of these countries. So, this is another parallel. And very incidentally, the 1944 conference was also attended by 4 out of the 5 founding members of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, at that time it was Soviet Union, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, India, and China. So, 2 countries from the communist bloc, 1 country from the non-aligned bloc. India was actually part of the world order, and they all became part of the same world order, international institutions, and all those agreements which followed the Bretton Woods. So, now the same 4 countries were again part of the Kazan meeting. Very coincidence, whatever it makes it. And again, like Bretton Woods, the Kazan meeting is also talking about tectonic shift in the financial architecture of the world. In fact, the Bretton Woods was attended by more than 730 delegates, and the same thing happened here also. The only difference, if at all, if we have to say a word or two about the difference, in the case of Bretton Woods, it was actually facilitated by United Nations Monetary Financial Conference. It was held on 1st June 1944, and the conference by itself was presided over by the then U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. Henry Morgenthau Sr. was the one who presided over the American decision to recognize Israel as an independent country, but that it's a different story. We will go to that. And another very important economist who attended the Bretton Woods was, of course, Lord Keynes. Now, the Keynesian economy which followed, Keynes was also part of that summit, and he led the commission, that what they call the Commission 2, that dealt with the IBRD proposal, the bank proposal. So, and similarly in the case of BRICS, I purposely put it in the inverted commas as BRICS de-dollarization summit. One summit proposed and established dollar as the most important currency of the world, and 80 years later, the BRICS actually met and tried to decide to demolish the dollar as the currency of the world. So that is why I called it a dollar meeting and a de-dollarization meeting. This de-dollarization summit is also trying to establish an economic and a political system wherein we can call it as a world order, which are actually going to challenge the present world order. Whether it will be able to do it or not, how best it will be able to do, what kind of things it will happen, we don't know. And but fortunately, the BRICS is starting already, which has a BRICS Development Bank that is called the New Development Bank, which was formerly called the BRICS Development Bank. So now it already has a banking system, and if at all this banking system has to come in the place of International Monetary Fund, we don't know how far it will be able to suggest and how far it will be able to sustain a de-dollarized global economy. That is yet to be seen. But the bigger question is, you said Bretton Woods versus BRICS. So is it going to be Bretton Woods versus BRICS, or is it going to be Bretton Woods and BRICS, or is it only going to be BRICS? These are all questions that is very difficult to answer as of now, because the first question that comes to the mind is, will BRICS be accepted by the rest of the world as Bretton Woods agreement was accepted? Number one. Number two, is there any currency that can replace the dollar as of now? Is it going to be euro, yuan, pound sterling, rupee, ruble, or cryptocurrency, what is going to replace the dollar? Or it's going to be something, none of this, something different, something like a totally different currency, or a sort of artificial currency that need not be printed. Is it going to be some sort of a currency that doesn't see the light of the world at all? It's going to be a sort of a computerized barter economy. We don't know. Things are changing so fast. The kind of shifts that are happening in technology, one do not know what is going to happen to any of these currencies in the world tomorrow. So actually, ironically, both Russia and China were part of the BRICS Kazan meeting, and both of them more or less had a similar outlook as far as de-dollarization is concerned. And the Prime Minister of India, he suggested in that meeting, he advocated for the use of local currency systems for cross-border trade settlements. So this local currency system is already in vogue. Already there are 22 countries in the world which are open to sort of local currency systems through there is a provision in the Reserve Bank which is called the rupee Vastro accounts. SRVS, we are calling it as SRVS. So we are already having these rupee Vastro accounts with the help of the Reserve Bank in 22 countries. So is it going to be an extension of the local currency system as far as the BRICS is concerned? Whether this will be accepted by other countries, especially China and Russia, whether the BRICS will officially accept this as a currency settlement issue, these are all questions. Already India and Russia are trading in this manner. India and Iran are trading in this manner. India and China are trading in this manner. There are other countries with which India is trading. Therefore, a kind of Vastro account could be there. So, all said and done, Brettonwoods and BRICS, what the world is going to face tomorrow, and how the economic and political system of the world is going to change, and what Kazan is going to come up with, and how long Kazan decision will stick with as far as the world order is concerned. These are all huge questions that only future can answer. We don't know as of now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Seshadri, for very, illuminating narration of the origin of Bretton Woods versus BRICS and the current situation, and you have put all the relevant questions on the table. Now it's my honor and privilege to invite Professor David Soong from mainland China to give his perspective, mainly a Chinese perspective, for the next 8 minutes. Professor Soong, kindly stay to the timeline of 8 minutes. The platform is yours, Professor Soong.
Okay, thank you, guys. Thank you, professors, distinguished doctors and professors. Actually, what today I want to focus on is cooperation rather than competition. And of course, I do believe that there should be competition between different countries and different continents, and the world should not be dominated by only one country or one continent. However, I think that cooperation between different countries is more important in this world. We know that the Bretton Woods system was established in 1944 during a conference in Bretton Woods with the aim of creating a stable global financial structure in the post-World War II era. Its key institutions, International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created to promote global economic stability, facilitate international trade and aid in post-war reconstruction. Over time, these institutions adapted to changing global dynamics, focusing on financial stability, economic development, and poverty reduction. However, the Bretton Woods institutions have historically been dominated by Western powers, especially by the United States and the European countries. And this has raised concerns about underrepresentations for emerging economies, including developing countries like China and India. While BRICS an alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, formed in 2009 as a counterweight to Western-led financial structures. This coalition represents a substantial portion of global GDP and population, and serve as a voice for emerging economies seeking a greater role in global governance. In 2014, BRICS established the new Development Bank to provide financing for infrastructure and development projects with fewer conditions than those typically associated with World Bank and the IMF. The NDB focuses on addressing the unique needs of developing countries and offering an alternative to established Bretton Woods institution. Well, the clash between Bretton Woods and BRICS, while a direct clash is not inevitable, competition and occasional tensions between Bretton Woods institutions and BRICS are likely to persist. Both sides cater to different economic needs and client bases, yet some overlap exists in the sphere of development finance and global economic influence. The Bretton Woods institutions provide stabilization and macroeconomic support, often with conditions for reform, while BRICS offers alternatives to infrastructure finance with fewer political constraints. One potential area of friction is BRICS intended to reduce reliance on US dollars, potentially challenging the dollar's status as the dominant global reserve currency. Additionally, BRICS countries have shown interest in forming an alternative financial system that aligns with the priorities of emerging economies. However, both sides also share a commitment to global economic stability, suggesting that a balanced coexistence is possible, with each system serving a complementary role. The new development bank has actually helped some countries. The new development bank has provided critical financing to several member and even non-member countries focused on infrastructure and sustainable development projects. Here I can give some examples. In South Africa, the NDB has recently approved a major loan of around 1 billion to support water and sanitation infrastructure under South Africa's Municipal Infrastructure Grant Program. This fund aims to address critical infrastructure gaps, especially in underserved communities. Additionally, South Africa's freight logistics have received support through a 5 billion loan to translate a public entity managing ports, rail, and pipeline infrastructure. India, the NDB has provided a $500 million loan to support the development of India's metro systems, improving public transportation and reducing congestion in major cities like Delhi. Additionally, the NDB has funded renewable energy projects in India, supporting the country's transition to a clean energy future. India has received funding for infrastructure and the sustainable development projects, totaling around 25.07 billion US dollars from the bank so far, with several projects focused on renewable energy and urban mobility initiatives. While at the same time, Brazil has also received loans from the BRICS Bank. So the NDB's flexible financing terms, which often come with few political and economic conditions, have appealed to BRICS members and the non-members alike. This is quite different from now the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank is quite different. We do not take political stance as the first condition. We provide money and loans to these countries in need. factors that affect the prospects of BRICS and potential solutions. At present, BRICS face several challenges in its development, economic and political diversity. The BRICS nations differ in economic power, political structure, and growth priorities. This diversity can create challenges in forming a unified economic policy and agenda. And we know that in countries like India, China, Russia, Brazil, yes, they also have some disagreements over certain fields. So how to solve this kind of problem? We can resort to a flexible approach to agreements that respects each member's unique conditions would help maintain cohesion. BRICS should prioritize collaborative projects that benefit all members while allowing flexibility for each country to pursue its interests. And all the countries should build credibility and trust. Unlike the IMF and the World Bank, the NDB is relatively young and must build a track record of transparency, accountability, and effective governance to be seen as a viable alternative. The solution is that the NDB should adopt the best practices from Brettonwoods institutions, establish transparent project evaluation and monitoring systems, and set high standards of governance. Well, there also exist geopolitical tensions between the members. BRICS include countries facing sanctions or tension with Western countries, which could limit its operation and access to global markets. For example, now Russia is actually sanctions have been imposed on Russia for its war with Ukraine. How to resolve this problem? I think BRICS should emphasize its role as a cooperative organization rather than a political bloc.
Focus on inclusive development. Time is over. Can you please conclude?
Okay. So, and provide alternatives without antagonism would help BRICS avoid direct conflict with Western powers. Anyway, in one word, I think that all the members of BRICS should cooperate with each other. They should put aside their political differences. They should combine their common interests together so that they can develop toward the same future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David Soong, for giving your personal as well as Chinese perspective on this particular topic. Now it's my honor and privilege to invite Vijay Nilekeni, who will more or less provide US and maybe Western perspective on this particular topic. Mr. Nilekeni, the platform is yours, sir. Please
okay, thank you. Can you see me, hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I think a lot has been explained about the Bretton Woods history and so on. So I'm not going to go over it. But what I will mention is that the Bretton Woods, when they created the World Bank and the IMF in late 1940s, they were using the gold standard. The gold was linked to the US dollar at $35 an ounce, and that was going to be the standard for controlling the fiscal policies and so on. That was abandoned in 1971 by Richard Nixon, President Nixon, because the demand for the World Bank and IMF services were escalating so rapidly globally that there was no way to back it up with gold. So he detached the gold standard from the funding. So they were able to unleash a lot more developmental funding worldwide. Just to compare the BRICS versus the Bretton Woods organizations, I'll just give a little bit of statistics because I think you'll appreciate the quantity of the scale and size of the two organizations. The World Bank has $77 billion on the books. It has a staff of 12,300 trained economists and technical people and management people. It has a global footprint with 145 member countries and 120 field offices around the world. The annual budget of the World Bank is $3.5 billion. India alone has borrowed $38 billion from the World Bank. It's the biggest borrower from the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund has 189 member countries and a permanent staff of 3,100 economists and other personnel, professionals. It has field offices in 162 countries and has created a special global currency called Special Drawing Rights, or SDRs, and that is used to bail out countries that are in the verge of bankruptcy or collapse. The International Finance Corporation is another organization part of the Brettonwoods family, over $1 billion in annual budget, and it helps private sectors in developing countries and helps privatization of government companies, creation of new stock markets and things like that. And of course, the World Trade Organization in Geneva is also a part of the Brettonwoods family. So now I'm going to talk about the statistics of BRICS. Basically, it was created in 2008. It's headquartered in Shanghai, China. It has only four field offices in member countries. One of them is in Gift City, Gujarat. The total funding is $50 billion, and its approval to go up to $100 billion. It created the New Development Bank, which is based in Shanghai. And I would say that it's a very small organization compared to the World Bank. I think it has only like about 300 employees or something like that. So the level of professionalism, competence, experience, risk assessments, etc., are not in the same league at the moment. I'm not disparaging BRICS. I think India should be a member of both and continue to be involved with all global organizations, including the Asian Development Bank and so on. But it's a pretty small operation at the moment. It also seems to be the sense I get is it seems to be a parking place for retired politicians. For example, the NDB, the president and CEO of NDB is Vilma Rousseff, who was the former president of Brazil. So it's a very tiny operation at the moment, and it's going to take a lot more to make it a mature operation. Some members have already withdrawn from it because they don't seem to have the confidence in it. Algeria and Argentina have withdrawn their membership application. And a majority of the countries that are interested from the global south, from Cuba to Zimbabwe, are aspiring to be members mainly to be able to borrow money. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are members from the point of view of oil markets and oil marketing their oil. Egypt and Ethiopia are members, and they have a lot of economic issues in their own home countries. So all this makes it, the membership looks very impressive in terms of population and growth, in terms of population and GDP, when you add it all up. But it's a long way from replacing the dollar, I think. So I wouldn't expect any shift in the near future in the next few decades, although there'll be continued progress. There is a low trust in cyber currencies, and one of the things that Russia is proposing is developing a BRICS cyber currency like Bitcoin to replace the dollar. So I would say that all this is at the moment in a very theoretical space. Some limited progress is possible in bilateral currency exchanges, as Professor Chari mentioned. For trading between two countries, they can buy and sell within using their own currencies. But that's a very tiny fraction of the global trading system, which is in the trillions of dollars. So large-scale disruption of the US dollar in the near term is really not practical, it looks like, in my opinion, as a global standard, and it's going to take a while for this to mature. The other new uncertainty is the election of President Trump. We don't know his position on this and whether he's going to help or hurt the process. He brings some positives. He has supporters who are very strong into cyber currencies. So it's quite possible that the cyber currency market will accelerate. But I don't know, that's still a speculative comment. So with that, I would say that India should participate in all this and continue multilateral relationships with all international organizations, including the Bretton Woods family of organizations, as well as BRICS and Asian Development Bank and other sources. So that's the end of my comments, and I will be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nilekeni, for very pertinent points and pertinent issues and figures that you have raised. And we are very happy that you were able to provide this particular perspective. Now it's my privilege to invite Ambassador Kamal Sibal. And Ambassador Kamal Sibal, with his vast diplomatic experience and academic experience, will give us a global synthesis about these two different mechanisms. So, sir, please come on the stage and platform is yours. Ambassador Sibal.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I'm not muted.
No, you
can hear
not.
me.
We can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Thank you. Well, some of the things that I wanted to say have already been said by Mr. Nilekeni, so I won't repeat that. What I was going to say was that, contrary to the way you presented the topic for discussion, which is relevant in the sense that there's a lot of concern in the West about BRICS and its rising profile and its prospective challenge to the West. That is clear. But it is not yet a clash of titans. Over the years, maybe it might become one, but currently to suggest that BRICS has reached a stage where it can take on the Bretton Woods institutions would not be realistic, because the scales are totally different, and it was brought out well by Mr. Nilekeni. See, BRICS is essentially a platform for what you might call South-South cooperation. If you look at its agenda, while there is an effort to carve out space for financial and economic cooperation outside the institutions of the West, but nevertheless, all these countries, barring Russia, have very close ties with the West. Iran also I would include in the category of countries which is dealing from the West largely. But the others have very close economic and defense ties with the West. And therefore, they are neither in the mood nor do they have a capacity to challenge the West and its institutions. IMF and the World Bank have over the decades carved out a position for themselves in global economic and financial space, which BRICS cannot match. Even the ADB has a much greater spread, and that is in Asia, than BRICS, for example. So if you look at the lending capacity of the IMF and its mandate and what it has done over the years, there may be a lot of resistance to the kind of conditionalities that the IMF lays out. And there's a lot of resentment that it is the Washington consensus that is imposed on countries, and it creates very serious social issues for these countries because they go in for austerity and fiscal prudence and everything else, which harms the development, or rather, it doesn't allow them to pursue their development objectives. And then, of course, the whole business about the market economy and reducing the role of the government in economic affairs, that's part of the Washington consensus. And then it is used very politically. You look at Ukraine, I mean, it has become the beneficiary of enormous billions of dollars of IMF funds when it is at war. And there's not a hell of a chance that it's going to being able to repay anything in the foreseeable future. Even with regard to the efforts to develop some kind of a currency of sorts which can help the BRIC countries trade with each other more easily. And that has become more pressing after what has been done to Russia, knocking them out of the global financial system, knocking them out of SWIFT, and making the whole issue of payments to Russia, trading with Russia, exceedingly difficult. So that has given any impetus to many countries of the global south, and that includes China too, which would want to develop mechanism by which they can continue to trade with Russia and make payments more easily. And that has been the focus of the latest BRICS summit at Kazan. The Putin has been very realistic about this himself, despite the fact that Russia is a country which has now, on which now thousands of sanctions have been imposed. He says quite openly that our purpose is not de-dollarization. That's not going to happen. In fact, he said, Russia is willing to use the American dollar, but it's the Americans who have prevented Russia from doing so, which has therefore compelled Russia to look for alternative mechanisms. So one of the solutions is to trade in national currencies. Now, over 90% of the Russia-China trade is in national currencies. But that is feasible because the exports and imports of the two countries are balanced. So they can do this. But look at the case with India. They have about $60-70 billion stuck in rupees in India because they can't buy. They don't have enough products to buy from India, which would enable them to use these rupee resources to get the products that they want from India. India itself does not want to enter into this debate of de-dollarization because politically it's very dangerous. But it is also very interested in the use of Indian national currency, and we've now had agreements with several countries, starting from Singapore, to enable payments, Indian rupees, UAE, for instance. This is the road down which India would like to go. But even with regard to use of national currencies in trade, the problem still remains, which is the reference currency. There has to be a reference currency, and the reference currency has to be the dollar. And if it's not the dollar, then you have to devise a system, which is not yet devised, of a basket of currencies, which will then be the reference point for assessing, establishing the respective value of the national currencies. So these are all things that are on the agenda, but will take a lot of time to realize on the ground. Putin said also something very interesting. He says you can think of a common currency if the countries having a common currency are at the same level of economic development. And he cited the case of the EU, where EU is facing a lot of difficulties because there's a huge disparity in the economies. Now, in the case of BRICS, you can see that there are massive disparities in terms of the size of the economies, etc., etc. There is a proposal by the Russians that we can use resource and commodities as the base for establishing the value of currencies and move away from the dollar standard. Finally, the BRICS countries, as I mentioned earlier, they have very, very strong links with the West. Now, the thing is that whatever might be the political agenda in terms of multipolarity, because all that is being discussed is part of building a multipolar system in the world. Because at the heart of the multipolar system is a degree of financial independence. I mean, if you don't have that, then you really can't have multipolarity. And we see it in our case. We talk about multipolarity, but we can't trade normally with Russia, and we're always afraid of secondary sanctions. Our banks are not willing to do some of the things that were agreed at Kazan in terms of strengthening banking institutions, cooperation between banking institutions, and all that. And at the end of the day, the US, EU, and the G7 cannot be ignored in the international economy. even if there are resentments about the way that they have dominated the global financial and economic system, which others want to see eroded. But that's not going to be easy. And finally, if you look at US share in the global economy, it remains virtually the same. Even if other countries have risen, China has risen, India is rising, but the US share of the global economy still remains. And last couple of points, which is that, as was rightly said, if you look at India, our total loans from the New Development Bank are about $4.1 billion. And they're involved in 2-3 infrastructure projects in India. But look at the kind of outstanding, the loans that we've got from the World Bank over the years, the figures have been mentioned. There is absolutely no comparison. And then the IMF, all said and done, because of the SDRs and everything else, and financial crisis management, debt issues, etc., it plays a role at a global stage, even though there is resentment, but it does. And countries run to the IMF, as we have seen. Pakistan has gone, Bangladesh wants to go, so many of Africa want to go when they are facing a crisis. They can't approach the BRICS, the NDB yet, because the NDB doesn't have resources. You know, they've sanctioned 12 billion, and I'll stop here, they've sanctioned $12 billion of infrastructure projects, but only $1 billion has been dispersed so far. So there are some institutional weaknesses also within the NDB. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kamal Sibal. So we had a very, very illuminating, very educating opening statements by 4 of our distinguished panelists. Idea is to, look at the pros and cons and not necessarily have a kind of competition between the two sides, but see how the mechanisms can work. So after the opening statements, we will have a round of questions from myself to all the panelists. I will start with Professor Chari. Professor Chari, you suggested that there can be several currency options, including digital currency or central bank related currencies. What would be your thought about any possible currency that could be used as a standard? Should it be pegged to the gold standard or not? Professor Chari, please.
Yeah, thank you. It was very illuminating, as you very rightly suggested. See, when I say, I did not say that which currency will replace the dollar, but what I meant was, which is the currency that can replace dollar? There is not one single currency that can replace the dollar. So therefore, I think we will have to have a combination of 3 basic ideas. One is the reference currency. Now, if dollar is the reference currency, dollar basically belongs to the US, so US dollar is the reference currency. So what happens is the geopolitical decisions of the US and also the political decisions of the US, whoever is at the helm of affairs in White House, plays an important role in the role that dollar also plays. For example, Ambassador Kamal Sibal mentioned about in India, Russia, US conflict of interest. A similar conflict of interest existed between China and US during Trump 1.0. So Trump even went to the extent of talking about trade wars. But in such a situation, what happens? You are keeping 2 very important countries, Russia and China, out of the global trade bloc. So this becomes an important issue. So that is one reason why we actually need an alternative economic system. I am not saying we need an alternate to dollar, but we need a reference currency which will not be subject to the kind of political interventions that is happening now. That is exactly what Putin is also saying. But of course, I'm not saying that Putin is always right in everything that he has suggested. But suffice to say that this issue is what is going to matter the most. A. B. There are difference of opinion as far as countries' dealings with other countries are concerned. There was a time when US had put sanctions on Iran and sanctions on Myanmar. India walked the talk. But what happened? we gave very strategic space. We lost a strategic space with Iran. That is why this time we have told the US that we are not ready to walk the talk as far as the issues are concerned. So there could be bilateral issues between US and A country, B country, C country, with which India wants to deal. So this comes in as a problem. So actually the idea of basket currency is already existing, but this basket currency does not have even a single Asian currency. The last that was included was Kuwait currency, and Kuwait was included. But otherwise, this basket currency will have to be expanded. So this is second thing that can happen probably. So nobody is talking about de-dollarization as such now, but when is somebody is talking about challenging dollar, it's for the dollar also to think what is wrong, going wrong with the dollar. That was my idea of putting it across. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chari. My next question goes to Professor David Soong. Professor David Soong, when we have a critique of Bretton Woods institutions, and there are sometimes arbitrary decisions taken by one particular country, there's a little bit of consternation in the rest of the world. But if you look at Bretton Woods institutions, they are essentially dominated by one country, which is United States. The headquarters of World Bank and IMF, both are in Washington, DC. Now, if BRICS and its financial institutions, the current and future, have to have some credibility amongst the members countries and the applicant countries, one of the important points and lessons learned from history is that the BRICS institution be not dominated by one single country, one large country. And in that sense, I'll pose very straight question. Would it make sense to shift the headquarters of NDB from China to another BRICS country so that there is not the same kind of domination as United States influences on World Bank and IMF, both being headquarters in Washington, DC, because otherwise essentially we'll be repeating the same story that China will be dominating BRICS and institutions. So does it not make sense to shift the headquarters of New Development Bank from Shanghai to maybe some other country in the BRICS? You're muted, sir. Kindly unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you for your question, Doctor. I did say that the Western economies and now the current payment system of Bretton Woods is dominated by some countries, especially by the United States. That is because the economy of the US is the strongest among all the countries, all the members, not just all the members of Bretton Woods, but across this globe. Well, I don't think that BRICS would be controlled by a certain country, but we know that some country should stand out to take the responsibility, to take their responsibility, so that the institution can function well. But it doesn't mean that China or India will control the whole body completely. I think that all the members can sit down to discuss with each other. They can form a system that is acceptable to all the nations. For example, rotating presidency. Well, this year, India will hold the presidency. Next year, China. The year next, well, for example, South Africa will hold the presidency. Well, I don't think that the country, for example, China or India, if you have the largest economy, you should have the final say. It's not that case. What I believe is that is all the members of these BRICS should unite, should discuss with each other, and they should design a scientific system that is acceptable to all the countries. When we cooperate with each other, some countries like to say, oh, I want to take the lead, I want to be in charge of all of you. That's not good. I think we should learn to be cooperative. Cooperation is the first ascent for all the nations.
The
Thank you.
question was that let's put it different way. Can the NDB headquarters shift it to Cape Town in South Africa or Sao Paulo in Brazil? Will that inspire more confidence in BRICS Plus or keeping it in Shanghai? That is the question.
Yeah, I know your question. Well, I think I have already answered this question. You should. You say that you want to relocate the headquarters to another
I'm just making a
place.
symbolic suggestion that BRICS and its
I think we should
not be
put
the
aside
same.
politics. Okay, we should put aside politics. We should take economy into consideration first, not politics. Otherwise, how can we develop together?
Thank you, Professor.
I think your question,
I've answered my
you know,
question. So
yeah,
I'll go
your
to the
question is
next.
somewhat irrelevant.
I'll go to the next panelist. The next question is for Mr. Vijay Nilekeni. Mr. Nilekeni, one of the problems with the United States is that having dollar as the reserve currency,
Yeah.
Federal Reserve Bank printing paper dollars for quote unquote domestic quantitative easing has a very bad influence on international, economics and the financial health of other countries. Now, if Bretton Woods institutions have to have some relevance, Bretton Woods institutions need to have some internal reform. And one of the internal reform would be that Federal Reserve Bank should not resort to quantitative easing. What are your views on that?
Well, I think it goes to the age-old argument about national sovereignty versus international sovereignty, if you will. I think part of the problem is the world is operating on massive deficits. The United States total deficits to date are $35 trillion. And each president since after Bill Clinton has added $1 trillion per $5 trillion per term, almost $1 trillion a year of deficit spending. And this is not just an American problem. Every country in the world has massive deficits. I was reading a white paper from the International Monetary Fund that the global deficits are $100 trillion. Japan has massive trade deficits. Even India, I think, has a lot of trade deficits. So the problem is, it's a management problem and a political problem. And I don't think that the Bretton Woods organizations have the clout or the influence, or they can give their advice and their opinions, but ultimately it's driven by national politics. And unfortunately, that's a global problem. And almost every country, the only countries that are really well managed are Singapore and Norway and Switzerland. Almost every other country is running on massive deficits and printing money. So this is a global problem of lack of political discipline and promising things that you can't keep and so on. So the politicians, it's very hard to rein in politicians. I'm pretty sure Trump is going to add multiple $1 trillion to the deficit. And this is a frightening scenario for the global economy, actually. But at the moment, every country is doing it on a massive scale. So I don't think multilateral organizations will have the clout or the influence. They can provide advice and counsel and saying that's a bad idea. But other than that, I'm not sure that there's much they can do because of this national sovereignty business.
Thank you, Mr. Nilekeni. My next question goes to Ambassador Sibal. Ambassador Sibal, you gave very profound, points about, BRICS and its institutions being actually in infancy compared to Bretton Woods institutions. So it's not a question of competition or contrast. It's a question of developing maybe a supplementary or complementary mechanism. Now, if you were asked for your advice by the BRICS and in institutions. What would be your advice to BRICS, BRICS Plus, and BRICS Bridge, or whatever mechanism that a country to how to steer forward this mechanism without getting into conflict with Bretton Woods institutions, and yet allow the luxury of having an alternative trading mechanism, alternative, currency mechanism for the global south? What would be your advice, sir?
Well, actually, they don't need my advice because they're on the right track. If you look at the Kazan Declaration, which is a consensus document, it's very clear what they want to do, the road they want to follow, without entering into any confrontation with the West. Even with regard to the IMF, they've been pressing for quota reforms. They haven't gone beyond that. And there's a persistent demand. India is also making the demand, so is China, this and that. If you look at the Kazan Declaration, they've talked about the reform of the current international financial architecture to make it more inclusive and just. And what you said earlier about United States printing printing notes and all that stuff, they reflected that in the declaration by saying that the development challenges of the developing countries feel the spillover effects from external shocks and the fluctuations of financial and monetary policies of some advanced countries, by which, of course, they essentially mean the United States of America, high interest rates, tighter financial conditions and all that, they directly affect the development objectives of the plans of the developing countries. There is a reference to the debt vulnerabilities of the low and middle income countries. They have also talked about the reform of the multilateral development banks to have blended finance. And the reason being that there should be more finance available to meet the debt problem of the developing countries. And since the World Bank itself has a limited portfolio, they should go beyond, they should go to the private sector and increase the corpus of funding and have new ways of lending. They've talked about that. And they've also talked about developing a new general strategy for the NDB, the New Development Bank, and improving its corporate governance. Also continuously expanding local currency financing. They want actually to expand the membership of the NDB also, so that more countries can benefit. That will, of course, mean more capital. At the moment, for the contingency reserve arrangement is only $100 billion. Earlier, you talked about the bank moving from Beijing or what have you. The problem is that if you look at the contingency reserve arrangement, it reflects the more or less the economic weight of the BRICS country, with China having 41%, and Brazil, India, and Russia having 18%, and South Africa 5%. And that also then puts a limit on how much these countries can approach the CRA to get over problems of liquidity and this and that. Some of the other things that they have done, in which there are problems, because India is facing that problem, is that to have more interbank cooperation. Now, Indian banks are very reluctant because of the overhang of secondary sanctions and not knowing how they operate and the complexity of it. So they don't want to have the established banks don't want to have business with Russian banks. And unless you have that, unless you have more Russian banks stationed here, it's an obstacle to trade. So there is a strong recommendation of interbank cooperative mechanisms, which should be then encourage the use of local currency. Then the cross payment system, which was mentioned earlier by Seshadri, so that this can help in the financial transactions between BRICS countries and strengthening corresponding banking networks to enable settlement in local currencies. There is a BRICS Clear project, which is intended to facilitate all this. And then reinsurance, arrangements, BRICS reinsurance arrangements, etc., etc. So there are a whole lot of, there's a huge accent on this part of the cooperation between BRICS countries, because that is at the heart of it. The rest is rhetoric, multipolarity, this, that, and equality, and just order, and stuff like that. It will only happen if you can achieve some of these things in reality. A slow erosion of the domination of the US dollar. One last point in this regard. Even China is very reluctant to allow its currency to be a reserve currency because they fear flight of capital, because then they can't exercise controls. So there is no even a strong economy like China. They're hesitant to challenge frontally the role of the US dollar. What they want is a change in the system, an improvement of the system, a slow erosion of dollar's dominance, which will happen, but will take time.
Thank you, Ambassador Sibal. I see a lot of questions in the chat room, and I'll start taking those questions. But before I go there, we have Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor join us. I will ask Ambassador Kapoor to give just 2 minutes comments. I know he has some questions here, but I would like his opinion, just 2 minutes comments on this particular topic, the way he feels this is going to go, the BRICS mechanism. Ambassador Kapoor, please. Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to be here and to have listened to the presentations and the comments by all the experts here on the channel. I have some points which I just want to make here, because I do agree with Ambassador Sibal when he says that it may not be, the right time as yet for a BRICS currency to really take on the challenges of the Bretton Woods system, because of the various problems which are faced within BRICS, the lack of, not lack, but at least the trust deficit between some of the partners themselves. And then the elections have thrown up President Trump as the next president of USA. In one of his speeches during his campaigns, he had said very categorically that his administration would impose a tariff of between 100% and 200% on all businesses and countries that do not use the US dollar as their reserve currency, as part of the Make America Great Again and America First. So I think, while discussions can continue on this, the creation of a new currency has to be given birth. It has to be stabilized. It has to mature. It has to gain strength. It has to face all these challenges of the, US reserve currency. And also the aspect of, BRICS challenging Bretton Woods can arise after India is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. I think that is the first step. Then there is a greater possibility of the BRICS currency, rising, increasing in importance and able to stand up. The other aspect is that when I see the World Bank today and the IMF today, a large number of posts are filled by Chinese officials. Some posts are filled by Indian officials at senior levels, including the president of the World Bank. The original concept was that not Indian officials, but Indian origin, Indian Americans. Because originally when the Bretton Woods institutions were conceived, a decision was taken between the Western world countries that the World Bank would be headed by a US person, and the IMF would be headed by a European person, and that has continued today. Today we have Ajay Banga as the president of the World Bank. He is an Indian origin person. He may not be an Indian citizen, but so some changes are happening in front of all of us. So those changes will become more and more apparent and more intense and extensive as time passes. So whether the BRICS countries are in a position, or whether they need to challenge the Bretton Woods at this stage, is a very big question mark. The other aspect which I would wish to reiterate here is what Dr. Adityanjee mentioned very clearly about thinking about whether the NDB itself could be moved to any other country to have a greater amount of trust, because the trust deficit of China in the global arena exists very severely, very seriously in a large number of countries, including in India. So how that trust deficit can be overcome and given, sort of a greater impetus can be given to this whole effort. I'll stop here. Back to you, Dr. Aditya.
Thank you, Ambassador Kapoor. I will start reading the questions from the chat room. The first question is by Dr. Shrikant Chopra. This question has been partially answered, but I will still put it there. With the ascendancy of BRICS, do you think Bretton Woods setup may modify or reform its objectives and operational procedures to be more attractive to other nations to undermine BRICS? Mr. Nilekeni, do you want to address that?
Yeah, in theory, that can be done, but it's a massive practical problem. The level of funding, the level of staffing, the level of technical expertise, the level of global presence, all these things don't exist at the moment in BRICS. It's mostly politicians, like leaders, national leaders meeting once a year or something, or twice a year. It's more like a talk shop rather than a real, very effective organization. There is really they don't have 2,000 economists and engineers and other types that the World Bank and the IMF have. So that's not going to be an easy task. And secondly is the funding level. I mean, we're talking of $100 billion that the World Bank has spent, and BRICS is total allowed money is 100 million, but 100 billion, but they have not even funded it to a fraction of that amount. So I think it's not going to be easy. And thirdly, I think transparency and public confidence in BRICS is going to take some doing, because it has to be very transparent and very open. And even, for example, the Chinese, there was a deficit with the Chinese that we talked about. It's going to be very difficult in a closed society, whether it's China or Russia, to have that public confidence. For example, the World Bank and IMF have spring and fall meetings that are attended from people from all over the world. The staffing is people from all over the world. So there's a high level of confidence that is not going to be easy to duplicate in the near term. It can be done over a long period of time as yet another multilateral institution, but it's going to take a long time and a lot of investments.
Okay, there is a question in the chat room by Mr. Amarjit Singh, and I'll read the question. If all multilateral fora, starting from the League of Nations, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, G20, are seen to be inadequate, then what new leverages are we discussing for building a more stable and equitable monetary and trade framework? What are actually the new ideas on the table, other than maybe going back to gold standard or moving on to Bitcoin, etc.? And I will address that question to Professor Seshadri Chari. Professor Chari, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, see, we should remember one thing. The Bretton Woods started with gold standard, but then, as Professor Vijay Nilekeni said, they had to ultimately give it up. So one particular standard is not going to be really workable. And there is no alternative to gold otherwise. Unless we do some asteroid mining and come up with a new metal, there cannot be a new metal that will replace gold also. So because there is no replacement for gold, and because there is no replacement for currency, the exchange rate currency, the dollar is still accepted. But if you see the deposits with central banks, almost 60% of the global central banks have dollar as the reserve currency. But then when you say 60%, what about the rest of the 40%? What are they doing? So therefore, it is not that there is not an alternative, but it's very important that we should have a very strong basket currency. And this basket currency rate could probably include some more currencies of South Asia, of Asia for that matter. China is of course included, Chinese currency is included, but we will have to add some more currencies. Probably there are 2 or 3 institutions like South-South cooperation is emerging as a very strong institution. Indo-Pacific is also emerging as a very strong institution. So this Indo-Pacific and South-South cooperation could probably come up. And also ASEAN, don't forget, ASEAN is an important institution as far as Asia is concerned. And then we also have RCEP, which is also coming up as a very big alternative, economic alternative. So there are institutions that are coming up. So these institutions will also have to be looked up. And the most important element that we are facing today, the biggest challenge that we are facing today, it's very sad to say this, and I'm really sorry that I have to say this, the total and abject failure of United Nations to address the issues, political, economic and geopolitical issues that are facing the country. And remember, Bretton Woods was facilitated by United Nations. BRICS was not facilitated by United Nations. So it is United Nations which will have to really play a leading role and expansion and so many other reforms that are supposed to take place. So these reforms are not just geopolitical reforms, these are economic reforms also, because geopolitics and geoeconomics are appearing to be 2 sides of the same coin.
Thank you, Professor Chari. I have one question, very brief question from Professor David Soong. Professor Soong, very recently after the Kazan summit, the United States State Department spokesperson gave a statement, very open statement, that any alternative to Bretton Woods, any alternative to dollar as a international currency is not acceptable to us. And the BRICS summit in the Kazan had basically suggested a trading mechanism for autocracies. And we were strongly discouraged these autocracies to start a new system. What are your comments on United States attitude towards BRICS plus mechanism in view of this open statement, Professor David Soong? Kindly unmute yourself.
Well, I think the U.S. government, especially Biden and Trump, Trump is more like a businessman. He is a businessman, not a president. So what he says, I'm afraid, he said that it is not acceptable to the United States, but I'm afraid the U.S. has to accept it because of this world, we have different countries, different systems. They have to coexist harmoniously. Even if the United States does not accept other currency systems or other payment systems, it has to face this trend. Or for example, right now, the BRICS has its own banks, and I think in the future, the developing countries will have more financial institutions like this to provide assistance to those in need. The United States is the biggest economy, but the United States is not the biggest helper to other countries. I don't believe that the United States has the final say in every aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Soong. I have one brief last question for Ambassador Kamal Sibal. Ambassador Sibal, Bretton Woods institutions, both IMF and World Bank, have been heavily criticized for putting conditionalities, pegging it to internal reform, structural reform. and encouraging sometimes sanctions even. Now, one would expect that the new mechanism or any alternative, or even if you want to use supplementary mechanism to the Bretton Woods systems, should not have similar kind of pattern of putting unilateral sanctions or putting conditionalities and things like that. In that respect, we are witness to the fact that China put sanctions on Japan on import of rare earths. And also China blocked certain loans in Asian Development Bank for India because they were in particular geographical locality in India. Does this inspire confidence in Global South about China's ability to play a financial and economic statesperson's role for Global South, keeping in view that they are also prone to putting sanctions and conditionalities in their bilateral mechanisms and multilateral mechanisms?
Well, if you talk about the whole debate on trusted supply chains, resilient supply chains, and friendshoring, and all that debate, why has that debate emerged? It is because, rightly or wrongly, especially after the COVID epidemic, they found that dependence on a single source for critical technologies, critical raw materials, was very dangerous. Therefore, countries now want to make sure that that sort of a situation doesn't occur again. And the fact that China imposed some restrictions on export of rare earths to Japan, it obviously is part of this debate about shifting supply chains away from a single source. It won't be easy. It won't be easy because China has had an industrial strategy of making sure that in certain areas they remain absolutely critical to the global economy, and their supplies from them become unavoidable. Now, whether it is the solar chips or semiconductors for that matter, and rare earths and lithium-ion batteries and electrical vehicles, they have carved out for themselves a dominant position in the areas in which the world is inevitably moving because of climate change and other considerations. Which is why, interestingly, the whole debate of decoupling has been buried, and now it is de-risking. China is the biggest manufacturing country in the world, so you can't eliminate China from the scene. In fact, if China ran into serious economic trouble, it'll have great repercussions on the global economy. So there it is. One can have distrust of China, and we have reason to be distrustful, but there are certain hard facts. Even in our case, look at the trade with China is $120 billion, despite Galwan and whatever happened in Ladakh. We were not able to move away because for certain critical raw materials and technologies, China is unavoidable. Unavoidable. Look at Germany. They are absolutely loath, the German industry, to move away from China because they've invested so heavily on China. Incidentally, you were talking about what happened in the rare earths. You've seen the latest debate between the German German minister who came here, economy minister, and Piyush Goyal, because we ordered a boring machine for tunnels from a German company, and the source of supply of this company is in China, and China is not allowing the export of that tunnel, a boring tunnel machine to India, because probably they think that we'll dig more tunnels near the border with Tibet. So whatever. So that is an issue. The China problem is an issue. However, to be fair, since we are talking, we have to talk sensibly and maturely. The point is that we, Western countries and some others, may have these doubts about China, but there are large parts of the global south which don't have these concerns. They are far away from China. They don't have contiguity. There is no power struggle with China. So China is seen as a benign partner, which is giving them development aid and stuff like that, even though it has been now shown that these countries get very heavily indebted to China, and that creates serious distortions in their own economic management. So whatever it is, this is the reality of the global scenario at the moment. But how this will then play out in terms of what we are discussing, the BRICS, and it is certainly a handicap in the BRICS. Let's not paper over this at all. India-China tensions. After all, we are the original members, founding members of BRICS. It actually began in my time when I was in office at the Russia-India-China dialogue. Then it became with Brazil BRIC, and then with South Africa it became BRICS. And the whole RIC dialogue to start with, which was the Russian initiative, was to try and see if differences between India and China in this trilateral format could be bridged. And that problem still remains. So BRICS will never be able to come on its own unless we can solve, unless we can reduce tensions between India and China.
Thank you, Ambassador Sibal. It has been a very interesting discussion, very informative and educational. My heartfelt thanks to Professor Seshadri Chari, Professor David Soong, Mr. Vijay Nilekeni, and Ambassador Kamal Sibal, who were able to find more than 1.5 hours of their time. My also thanks to our audience members on a Saturday morning or evening, wherever they are, who are able to find time for this discussion. And lastly, my thanks to Team CSA, specifically Mr. Ripudaman Pachori and Mr. Rajiv Verma, who helped me organize these kind of events and do all the background work and our pillars of support. So thank you very much indeed. Just last word as an editorial kind of position I have, it is the global cooperation, whether south to south or south to north. If we don't cooperate, we perish. So all the countries have to indulge in cooperation and sometimes leave the national, interests aside. Thank you very much indeed. And
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.